Thank you for joining us for this community information session that's hosted by the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. My name is Alex Chan. I'm currently the department chair for the Department of Clinical Pharmacy Practice and also a professor of clinical pharmacy. It's a pleasure to host this particular session because we're going to be talking about something very pertinent to us nowadays related to COVID-19 vaccines and specifically on the booster shots. While we are going to be waiting for more participants, I'm going to give a very quick introduction about today's session. Next slide, please. So the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences have been a great partner with the community in this whole COVID-19 pandemic. In the beginning of this year, and I think many of you have received notices related to a community information session that we held related to the vaccine when the vaccines were first rolled out in our community. So we held 2 community sessions and we talked about the science behind the vaccines. They were very well received and we had the opportunity to educate the community about receiving the vaccines. Next slide, please. And moving along, we were also very involved in terms of the rollout of the vaccines as well. As you see the photo here, on the UCI campus, we actually ran a vaccine clinic, and the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences had the pleasure to be part of the community to run this vaccine clinic, and we vaccinated more than 44,500 people in Orange County. Something that we're very proud of because as a proud community partner, we wanted to make sure that our people are healthy, they're getting the vaccines. Next slide, please. And we see that, right? Over the last couple of months, we saw the fact that, we had very low number of COVID-19 cases, likely related to the rollout of the vaccines. But something that's hitting us, and I think we are quite aware from the media, is that we're starting to see an increase of number of cases in our community very recently, likely due to the surge of the Delta variant. And we're also starting to hear that potentially there might be COVID booster vaccines that are considered by the government at this point and potentially by other agencies in the next couple of months. So I think this is a good time for us to revisit the topic related to vaccines, specifically whether or not that we should be receiving those booster vaccines and the science behind the matter. So which is why we decided that, next slide, please, to have this community information session today to talk about COVID-19 vaccine boosters. And next slide. We have 3 speakers who will be talking to us about various aspects of the COVID-19 vaccine boosters. So starting out by Dr. Lee Nguyen, who's going to talk to us about the current recommendations of the vaccines and also the vaccine effectiveness. Then Dr. Shawn Griffin will be talking about the use of the vaccines in immunocompromised individuals and also overall vaccine safety. And Dr. Keri Hurley-Kim is going to wrap up with public health implications of the vaccine booster. And hopefully we'll have ample of time at the end that we'll be able to take questions and answers from the audience. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know what they are and we'll try to address them at the end of the last talk. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our very first speaker. Next slide, please. Dr. Lee Nguyen, who is currently our Health Sciences Associate Clinical Professor at the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. He's going to talk to us about the current recommendations of the vaccines and also vaccine effectiveness. Dr. Nguyen.
Thank you, Dr. Chan, for the introductions. As Dr. Chan mentioned, I'll be talking about current recommendations as well as vaccine effectiveness. Next slide, please. So in this slide talks about the overall current recommendations. As we all know that Pfizer's is currently the fully FDA approved COVID vaccine for patients 16 years and older. The emergency use authorization is still in place for the Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is used in the 18 to and older population, as well as the emergency use for the Pfizer for 12 to 15-year-olds. What's interesting is that Pfizer most likely will submit most of the documents by the end of September. They could potentially have approval for emergency use authorizations for the 5 to 11-year-old group. as we know that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine uses 2 doses to really maximize the body's ability to produce antibodies, and the Johnson & Johnson uses 1 dose. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about the newest recommendation for a 3rd additional dose, 28 days after the 2nd dose in people who received either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccination. This is really intended for the patients who are immunocompromised, such as cancer patients, organ transplant patients, stem cell transplant patients, advanced or untreated HIV, or using like medications that really inhibit the immune system. So far, the recommendations are only for those populations, but newer recommendations are expected to be released soon regarding the booster dose. So this next slide that's listed is a slide that was released from the CDC that talks about vaccine effectiveness during the June to August time period. Overall, as you see from the red lines, you can see that the overall vaccine effectiveness in preventing hospitalizations is about 86%. You can see fully vaccinated people are only hospitalized about 3.1% compared to almost approximately 19% unvaccinated. It is further broken down into 2 groups in terms of ages. The 18 to 74-year-old group has an overall vaccine effectiveness of 89%. Again, about roughly 3% of the fully vaccinated are hospitalized in comparison to approximately 21%. And the lowest group is the 75-year-old plus group, has an overall vaccine effectiveness of 76%. Again, roughly 3% of fully vaccinated patients are hospitalized in comparison to unvaccinated, which is roughly 11%. Next slide, please. So the rationale behind the booster or additional doses listed, it's typically due to either that limited immune response to initial doses in those immunocompromised patients, or potentially the second reason is the waning antibody over time. To date, we know that antibodies persist up to about approximately 8 months after COVID infection and at least 6 months after the second mRNA dose. Next slide, please. So because of the potential for waning, there's been some research that's looked into the potentiality of doses given early compared to later in the year of this past year. So what's listed inside the peach boxes in comparison to the teal boxes are 2 groups of patients. The peach boxes were vaccinated in January to February of 2021 in comparison to March and April. And as you can see in the comparison in terms of positivity rates, in terms of acquiring COVID, across the different groups, whether it's 16 to 39, 40 to 59, or 60 or combined, patients who were vaccinated later had a lower rate of acquiring COVID. So this may potentially suggest that there is a decrease or waning of antibody protection. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the potential waning of immunity as seen through COVID infections compared to this slide shows 2 graphs depicting antibody levels. The graph on the left shows antibodies level after 1 week after the second Pfizer dose, and the graph on the right shows antibody levels 6 months after the second dose. So each dot represents antibody levels with the vertical axis showing concentration of the antibodies, and on the bottom horizontal graph shows age. And then the line down the middle is the average. And then in terms of like age, you can kind of see that the number of antibodies are actually lower as you age. And then comparison between the first week and the 6th month, you can see the overall average has decreased a little bit, showing that there is potential waning of antibody over time. Next slide, please. So this slide refers to the Moderna vaccine. This slide shows the antibody response in terms of the left axis showing 50% of the antibodies that can neutralize virus. And then after the first dose and the second dose shown on the little red arrows on the bottom, and where it has a peak level roughly 2 weeks after the second dose or on day 43, and decreases over time. And what's seen here is you can see the 3 different groups, the 18 to 55, 56 to 70, and the greater than 71-year-old group. As you can tell that, again, as you age, there's a less of an antibody production or antibody neutralization in this case, and they are declining over time. The interim release from the phase 3 trials suggests that the Moderna vaccine is effective for at least 6 months, but as you can tell, it is waning over time. Next slide, please. So this last slide in terms of like antibody refers to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Again, in terms of the graph, you can kind of see the neutralizing antibodies on the left, and on the bottom, horizontal axis shows the days after primary vaccination. After the initial primary vaccination, the antibodies do peak, and then they are sustained up to roughly 8 months after the dose itself. It is waning, and the second aspect is the greater than 65-year-old in black lines, as you can see, are definitely slightly lower in terms of antibody response compared to the 18 to 55-year-old. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide that talks about outcomes associated with the third dose of the Pfizer vaccine. So this study was from Israel with over 1 million participants of 60-year-olds and older. It talked about if you received a booster dose on the bottom row compared to getting the standard 2 doses, and patients that received that third dose had only 313 infections in comparison to 3,473 infections overall. And in terms of severe infections, it was only 32 compared to 330. One of the authors concluded that it's roughly an 11 and 15-fold factor difference in terms of acquiring this after receiving a second dose. So there's a protective aspect of receiving this third dose. And that is it for my last slide. I would like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Shawn Griffin, who is the health science assistant professor, who will be talking about immunocompromised individuals and overall health safety, vaccine safety.
Thank you for that introduction. My practice area is stem cell transplant and cellular therapy. So taking care of immunocompromised individuals is something that I do on a daily basis, and I've done all throughout the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please. First up, I'll talk about the need and the rationale behind the additional dose in these immunocompromised patients, as well as detail exactly which patient population the word immunocompromised encompasses. Next slide, please. Before I delve into some of the data that I'm going to talk about, I think it's important to understand the distinction between the two terms, the term booster versus additional dose, at least according to the CDC. The CDC is very clear, and they do differentiate between the two terms, where a booster dose refers to someone who mounts a sufficient immunity the first time they receive the standard series of vaccine doses, but that immunity sort of weans over time, similar to some of the material that we had presented previously in this presentation. This is in contrast to an additional dose, which is giving either a second dose of someone who may have received a 1-dose vaccine series, or a third dose to someone who may have received a 2-dose vaccine series, where they don't mount a sufficient immune response with just the standard dose series, and they require an additional dose to have an immune response similar to healthy individuals or the normal population as a whole. Next slide, please. In immunocompromised individuals, we'll be talking specifically about the need for an additional dose. And this is in part because we know that this group of patients has a reduced immune response when compared to the population as a whole. Less than 50% of patients may mount an immune response similar to the healthy individual groups. And it's further complicated by the fact that there is no established immune correlate for protection from the vaccines. We saw in previous slides sort of those antibody levels and how they may change in different populations or over time, but there's no specific level or immune response that can guarantee protection. What we do know when we look at vaccine sort of effectiveness is the rate of breakthrough infections. And in particular, in the immunocompromised patient population, there is an increased rate of breakthrough infections. If you look at immunocompromised individuals as a whole, they represent 3% of the population. But if we look at breakthrough infections, specifically those patients with severe COVID that require hospitalization, the immunocompromised patients represent greater than 40% of these breakthrough infections. Next slide, please. Here is the list of what sort of constitutes someone with a moderately or severely compromised immune system. Those patients who are potentially candidates, at least under the expanded use authorization through the FDA, to receive an additional dose of an mRNA-based vaccine. These are patients who received active cancer treatment for tumors or blood cancers. They received an organ transplant and are taking immunosuppressants. They received a stem cell transplant within the last 2 years, or they received one at any point in time and are still taking immunosuppressants. They have either moderate or severe primary immunodeficiency disorder. They have advanced or untreated HIV infection, or they're on active treatment with high-dose steroids. Regardless of whether or not a particular patient has one of these various factors that may define them as having a compromised immune system, I think all decisions need to be based on a particular or an individual patient's circumstance and overall healthcare history through a detailed discussion with their healthcare provider before recommending a vaccine in a specific patient. Next slide, please. Though regardless, we do know that these vaccines, even a third dose of an mRNA vaccine, is safe in immunocompromised individuals. And a lot of this stems from the fact that many of the adverse reactions are associated with the immune response that the vaccine causes. And while there is limited data available, we know that in general, immunocompromised individuals have less of an immune response to the vaccine. So in theory, they have less of a chance of having one of the adverse reactions. In the table here, this is from a small study that looked at giving 3 doses of an mRNA-based vaccine to immunocompromised individuals. And what they found is that after the second dose, roughly 34% of patients had a mild to moderate adverse reaction. And then after the third dose, there was a similar rate of 37%. But when you look at the healthy population or the population as a whole, nearly 60 to 70% of patients who weren't immunocompromised experienced a mild to moderate adverse reaction after a standard dose series. So certainly the vaccine overall is safe in immunocompromised individuals. Next slide, please. Now, while we're on the topic of vaccine safety, I think a lot of information has certainly been discussed and come out over the past few months, not necessarily in the immunocompromised patients or those patients receiving additional or booster doses, but those patients receiving sort of the standard vaccine series. And I think it's important to talk about these because this is often sort of the root of a lot of vaccine hesitancy among the community as a whole. So I wanted to take a few minutes just to briefly talk about vaccine safety in the general population and those patients receiving the standard series of vaccines. Next slide, please. The most common adverse reactions that typically occur within a few hours to a few days of receiving one of the COVID vaccines are listed here. The particular list here occurs in greater than 10% of patients receiving the Pfizer vaccine, but they're very similar reactions and similar incidences among all of the available vaccines in the general population. Next slide, please. But I wanted to detail a little bit more is talking about the rare but serious adverse reactions, because this is often what's talked about in the community, within the media, and certainly I've seen the Facebook post or two talking about these rare but serious adverse reactions. All of the adverse reactions I'm going to talk about here have been reported and available through the CDC's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and the numbers are accurate as of the end of August of this year. The first 2 reactions on the list, anaphylaxis and Guillain-Barré syndrome, aren't necessarily only related to the COVID vaccine, but rather vaccines in general. For example, anaphylaxis has been reported after the COVID vaccine at a rate of approximately 5 per 1 million doses of the COVID vaccine that have been administered. To put this into a little bit of perspective, certainly as a pharmacist, I always think about medications first, but if you take a standard medication like the antibiotic penicillin, the rate of anaphylaxis is nearly 1,000 times higher than it is in patients receiving the COVID vaccine. So certainly it's very rare in this particular patient population after the COVID vaccine. Guillain-Barré syndrome So when the immune system, perhaps activated by a vaccine, attacks some of the nerve cells in the body, causing muscle weakness and in rare cases paralysis. If you look at the incidence in those patients after getting the COVID vaccine, it's less than 1 case per 1 million doses of the COVID vaccine that's been administered. This is in line with other vaccines that are commonly administered, such as the seasonal flu vaccine or even the tetanus shots that you may receive as vaccines as part of the normal schedule. I do want to talk about the remaining 3 rare but adverse reactions individually in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. The first I want to talk about is thrombosis, and particularly thrombosis with associated thrombocytopenia syndrome. So thrombosis or blood clots, but in the setting of having one of your blood cells that's responsible for stopping bleeding being incredibly low. So it's sort of this paradoxical syndrome where you're at an increased risk of clotting, but also at an increased risk of bleeding. And I think it's most well described and associated with those patients who received the J&J vaccine. But of the more than 14 million doses that have been administered, there's only been 44 confirmed reports of this thrombosis with associated thrombocytopenia syndrome. And it appears that it occurs at a slightly higher rate in women younger than 50 years old. And I think this patient population should certainly be aware of this potentially rare but adverse side effect if they were to receive the J&J vaccine. But again, it's still extremely rare with less than 3 cases per 1 million doses administered. Next slide. In regards to myocarditis and pericarditis, so inflammation of the heart muscle and inflammation of the tissue around the heart, of the nearly 370 million vaccine doses that have been administered, there's been fewer than 800 confirmed cases as reported by the CDC. And it does appear to be at a higher incidence in younger individuals as well as adolescent males. And most cases have been reported after the mRNA vaccine, in contrast to the J&J vaccine that we saw with thrombosis. But again, it is still an extremely rare incidence with fewer than 2 cases per 1 million doses administered. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to talk about death after vaccination as a potential rare but serious adverse reaction. Of the nearly 370 million doses that have been administered, there have been greater than 7,200 reports of death through the CDC's vaccine adverse event reporting system. However, it's important to understand that healthcare providers are required to report any death after a patient receives the COVID vaccine, even if it's unclear whether or not that vaccine was the cause of the death. In fact, when people have looked at these reports of death, there is no established causal link to the COVID-19 vaccines themselves. But if we just take the raw incidence, it is still extremely rare with fewer than 20 cases per 1 million doses administered. Next slide, please. But I think it's important to put sort of these numbers, these incidences, these few cases per 1 million doses administered in the context of why it's important for patients to get vaccines. And that's because of the complications that can occur if the patient were to develop severe COVID-19 infection requiring hospitalization. If we look at similar complications in these patient populations, if we look at thrombosis, if we look at myocarditis, if we looked at death, you can see that the estimated incidence and the per 1 million cases is thousands of times, if not tens of thousands of times higher than it is in those individuals who received the COVID-19 vaccine when looking at those rare but serious adverse infections. And I think it highlights the overall importance of ensuring that our immunocompromised patients do have a sufficient immune response to the vaccines, and that we're constantly looking at the data to see if booster doses are needed to provide patients, to provide individuals, to provide the community with sufficient protection and ensure vaccine effectiveness so that we can prevent the much more common severe complications that can be associated with COVID-19. Next slide, please. And to end our discussion today, I'll turn it over to Dr. Keri Hurley-Kim, who is also a health sciences assistant clinical professor in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, as well as the vice chair of the Immunization Coalition for LA County.
Thank you, Shawn, for that introduction. I wanted to just kind of wrap this session up by talking about some of the public health implications. So we've heard a lot of the data and the science on why we might be talking about boosters, what it means for patients, but we also need to consider what the idea of boosters means for community and for the world population as a whole. Next slide, please. So there are some things that we know about booster doses and additional doses. All of these things are things that we have been discussed by the previous two speakers. So I won't go into too much depth here, but just that we don't have any specific safety signals related to boosters or additional doses, especially compared to the original or initial 2-dose series. Nothing to suggest that there are safety issues unique to follow-up doses of any kind. We also know that booster doses in particular, especially in patients who are not immunocompromised, do provide a significant increase in antibody levels, even compared to what is seen with the initial 2-dose series. Also, that the 3rd dose, I think, is very important for patients who are immunocompromised who may not have had a sufficient immune reaction to an initial series. We also know that protection, especially against hospitalization and complications and severe outcomes with COVID, does last for at least 6 to 8 months. And my suspicion is that it actually lasts much longer, especially in the general population with just that primary series. Next slide, please. And having said all that, there are still a lot of open questions. So a lot of things that we don't yet know about booster doses and things that are still being studied. So one of these things was touched on a little bit before, and that's the question of whether waning antibody levels actually do correlate directly with waning protection. So just because we see antibody levels decreasing over time, does that mean protection is actually disappearing? We don't yet know the full answer to this question. The next question that we do also need an answer to is the effect of the Delta variant on what we have seen as a decrease in efficacy in recent months. We don't know the exact share of that being contributed by new variants versus being contributed by waning protection. The third one, and I think this might be the most important, is the opportunity cost of offering boosters to a large sector of the population versus spending efforts and resources increasing initial vaccination rates. And I think this is something that has really serious implications. And then also how to cope with the logistics of a large scale booster campaign, assuming that we will not be restarting this mass vaccination effort that we saw over the winter and the spring. I think there's a lot of talk of leaning really heavily on pharmacies, which I think is, a really positive solution. And I think pharmacies will continue to play an extraordinary role in primary immunizations and also in booster doses. But we do need to consider, what does that mean in terms of the workload on our pharmacy system? Next slide, please. Important to consider some of the disparities that we see in vaccination rates and how that may have an implication when we talk about boosters. So it's really difficult to use these numbers and compare region to region. But I think the biggest value of this slide and the information here is just to point out that we are continuing to see really severe, especially racial and ethnic, but also age-related and geographic disparities in terms of vaccination rates. And what I think we should be taking away from this is that we do need to commit considerable additional resources to reach those who remain unvaccinated. I know there's a lot of sentiment about, people who are not vaccinated at this point are never going to get vaccinated. Forget about them. Let's move on to boosting. But I think this may not be giving the full picture, because there are people who truly do have access issues I think there are people who may just need additional information and additional education in order to be more accepting of vaccination. So I think we need to really be careful not to forget about those people who are remaining unvaccinated. Next slide, please. We also have probably even more extreme disparities in vaccination rates when we talk about the worldwide population. So worldwide, we can, say 42% of people have received at least one dose. If you just look at that number, I think you can see it steadily climbing and think we're making great progress. But the other side of this coin is that only 1.9% of people in low-income countries have received at least one dose of the vaccine. So what this means is virtually every vaccination that has been administered to protect against COVID has gone to people in a wealthy or middle-income country. And this is a statistic that I think should be truly shocking, because the low-income countries where we have very large swaths of the population completely unvaccinated are where we're going to start to see additional variants of concern coming from. Next slide, please. Just a couple weeks ago, the committee within the CDC that provides recommendations on vaccinations, the ACIP, had a big meeting. They discussed in depth a lot of the data behind booster doses and what the potential recommendations might be. So some of the kind of take-home points from this meeting were that lower effectiveness that we saw with the vaccinations over the summer was likely related to a combination of waning immunity, but also the Delta variant, and that it's very difficult to say which of these factors is playing the biggest role. They also did conclude that boosters might provide a greater benefit for certain groups, and these are groups where we're seeing a lot more breakthrough infections. So this is immunocompromised patients. This is patients who are older, especially over the age of 75, those who reside in long-term care facilities, and also healthcare providers. They also were able to discuss that vaccines do continue to provide a very high level of protection in the general population against the outcomes that we're most concerned about. So yes, breakthrough infections are important, but what's even more important is protection against serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And that even with that primary series, a majority of the general healthy population is going to continue to be protected. And then also that there are likely to be a lot of complexities associated with implementing a really widespread booster program. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of one of the summary slides that showed, you can see through different studies and different populations with different vaccines, an overall trend toward a reduction in vaccine efficacy through summer of 2021. But at the same time, we see the rise of Delta through that same period. And this is why it makes it really difficult to say, are these efficacy numbers going down because it's been a period of time since these individuals were vaccinated, or is it because of the increased contagiousness associated with Delta? Next slide, please. So one of the biggest things, and I think this is really important to keep top of mind for those of us, who are really eager to get a booster. I know I have a 2-year-old daughter, and the idea of facing another winter where my vaccination status is probably, the biggest protection for her is really scary. So I understand, the idea of wanting to be boosted and be as protected as possible. But I think at the end of the day, the top priority really should continue to be focusing on unvaccinated individuals. And this was, one of the last points that the CDC committee discussed, that the primary recommendation for boosters should focus on those who are at increased risk for severe disease, and also that we will need to consider how to make this simple and feasible and flexible for both, the healthcare system that's administering these vaccines, and also equitable for the populations who are receiving them. Next slide, please. And then just to kind of compare, so I know what's been in the news probably more than the CDC discussion is this DHHS recommendation. And I think it's really important to remember that this is directly linked more to the White House and political entity as it is compared to the FDA or the CDC, where they stated, in my opinion, a little bit prematurely, that they would be prepared to offer booster shots to all Americans starting 8 months after the end of their primary series. They have since even talked about shortening this time period, offering them as soon as 5 or 6 months after a primary series. But there is a note there that this would likely begin with healthcare providers, nursing home residents, and other seniors, because those are the people who were vaccinated first initially. And then this is a little bit different than what the CDC kind of previewed as their possible recommendation, that they would very specifically recommend boosters for long-term care residents, healthcare personnel, and adults either over the age of 65 or over the age of 75. So long as it had been a particular period of time, maybe 6 months, maybe 8 months since the last vaccination. So this recommendation from the CDC may not be as widespread as the White House is hoping for to apply to every adult who may have already received a vaccine. Next slide, please. That's all the information we have for you, but we would love to also take your questions. So I'll turn it back over to Dr. Chan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hurley-Kim. We had a series of lectures earlier on, and now we're coming to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Ever since we opened registration for the webinar, we've been receiving a lot of questions from the community, and we are very grateful that we're able to address some of them. And we are also receiving questions from the audience today. We may not be able to address every single question, but if there are any unanswered questions, we'll try to address them via email this week. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start kicking off with some questions that we received over the week, and then we stream over to questions that we received today. So, hearing again, just related to antibodies and immune response of our bodies, right? Dr. Nguyen, maybe you can comment a little bit about this, but what is the downside of getting the booster earlier? And I think Dr. Hurley-Kim had also sort of talked about as well, is it 8 months, 6 months? So how early is too early? Maybe you can address a little bit of that.
So first off, the current vaccinations are effective. We talked about the goal is not to prevent the sniffles. The goal is to prevent those major aspects such as hospitalization, mortality, death. So currently the vaccines are effective against Delta. In the first slide that we talked about during the outbreak of the different 9 states, it's about 86%. And for some people, having, especially for healthy people, sometimes a longer interval between the second and third dose may be beneficial because they already have lasting immunity. So giving a third dose will prolong their immunity. Think of it as filling up a gas tank. If your tank is already 3/4 full, adding more gas is not going to make you drive further, right? To get to the full marker. So the aspect of you want this immunity to last as long as possible. But in terms of the mRNA vaccines, the CDCs recommend administering doses as close to the recommended interval as possible. So once it's become recommended, you want to make sure that you fall within that interval process. And in general, if the vaccine is inadvertently administered early, the CDC recognizes that it's only a 4-day grace period, which allows the dose to be considered valid and does not require repeating. So that's the downside. If you do definitely do it too early, it may not be effective, and you may actually have to give again later again.
Great. We got a question related to the safety of the vaccines and something that Dr. Griffin can address. So why is myocarditis more common in adolescent men?
I think that's a great question. And certainly the simple answer is we don't know. But what we do know is that myocarditis in general is more common in adolescent men, regardless of it's related to the vaccine or other severe illness or other types of infection. And part of this is believed to perhaps be related to testosterone exposure. So certainly we don't have a clear concrete answer, but likely there might be some role that testosterone plays and why we see a higher incidence of myocarditis, not just after COVID vaccine, but after many other various disease states and other interventions in that adolescent male population.
Very interesting. And I'm pretty sure that we need more science, more studies to understand, why is this mechanistically happening? there's a question, and I think this is probably more for Dr. Hurley-Kim, or any of the speakers. Does the discussion on boosters means that we will have annual COVID vaccines, which basically are very similar to flu shots?
This is a good question, and one that I get from patients a lot as well. The idea, are we talking about repeating this over and over and over, or is this something that we repeat it once and that's it? So we have vaccines that work both ways. The flu shot, of course, we're familiar with needing a dose every year, as opposed to something like hepatitis B vaccine, where we have a series of doses given on a particular interval, given only 3 doses, and then we consider for most people to be protected for the lifetime. I think the short answer, unfortunately, again, is we don't know exactly which way COVID vaccinations will end up. I think a lot depends on whether or not we see variants that end up escaping our immune response to this vaccine. Are we going to need updates against different strains or different variants in the same way that we get updated flu shots against different strains each year? Or is it more similar to the hepatitis B vaccine, where maybe we eventually all get a booster of this single vaccine and it provides very robust, very long-term protection against the variants we have now, and hopefully those that come to be in the future. So unfortunately, we don't have a very good answer to this question, but either way, it is in line with the way that we do vaccines currently. It just depends on the immune response, the virology involved, lots of different factors. So more research to come.
And this follow-up question, again, this is for Dr. Hurley-Kim as well, which I think is related to the response that you've given earlier. So for somebody, so for example, a senior, to get both COVID vaccine booster as well as the flu shot, can they get them at the same time? And if any precautions you think that might be necessary to observe, what would they be?
Sure, yeah. So as we head into flu season, I think this is another question that is going to come up a lot, especially for people who maybe have not been vaccinated against COVID previously, or maybe are now eligible, based on recommendations that may be coming out, to receive a booster, or they're immunocompromised to receive an additional dose. And I think regardless of whether we're talking about COVID and a flu vaccine, or COVID vaccine and another vaccination, regardless of the age of the person, CDC has now in the last couple months come out to say that it's okay to give vaccines concurrently, meaning you can get your COVID vaccine, whether that's your first, second, or a follow-up dose, on the same day that you get your flu shot or your tetanus shot. And I have been doing this for my patients in the clinic too. I think it's really important not to miss those opportunities to vaccinate against flu, just because we're focused on COVID, or protecting against other diseases as well. So no specific precautions. You may have 2 sore arms instead of 1. Maybe plan to take the next day off work if that's a consideration for you, but no specific serious or long-term safety concerns.
Thank you. This question is related to herd immunity, and I think it is important because we've been talking about vaccinating enough population so that we can achieve herd immunity. Will the booster shot help with the herd immunity? Dr. Nguyen or any of the speakers?
So once the booster shot is recommended, it'll help with your immunity and preventing it from waning over time. But getting the booster shot does not change the number of people who have immunity to COVID. So essentially, it's not going to be increasing the number of people who actually are immune. Most beneficial aspect is what Dr. Kim mentioned previously, is to get more people who are unvaccinated vaccinated.
Right. And we have questions specifically related to immunocompromised hosts. So if an immunocompromised individual receives, for example, the J&J vaccine, and this is a bit tricky, should they get another additional dose? Dr. Griffin?
I think that's a fantastic question, because I know a lot of infusion centers for their oncology patients have been, at least initially, we're giving the J&J vaccine because it's simple, right? You get 1 dose of the vaccine and you're done, especially in such a high-risk patient population. But unfortunately, with the data emerging from the J&J vaccine as a whole, it's always a few months behind what we have with the mRNA-based vaccines. So again, I think the simple answer is we simply don't know, but I think more information will become available. And I think it's reasonable to have the hypothesis that patients will likely have less of an immune response, the immunocompromised patients, to a single dose of J&J, similar to 2 doses of mRNA vaccine. So I think it's likely that we'll see similar recommendations with the J&J vaccine, but at this point in time, we simply don't have the data to make a recommendation. So I think each case needs to be individualized to the particular patient in a discussion with their healthcare provider to determine what's best for their particular case and their particular situation, taking all sort of personal factors into account.
Thank you. And looking at the time, it's 12:46. I know we initially said the seminar will go all the way to 12:50, but we're getting a lot of questions. So in order to address more of these questions, we'll try to extend the webinar to 12:55. We're getting some more questions that are related to what is the status of being immunocompromised, and maybe Dr. Griffin can address that. So are people who are undetectable HIV patients eligible to get the COVID vaccine booster shot at this time? Dr. Griffin?
I think a lot of it would depend on the specific patient factors. I think if they had an undetectable load in a normal immune system at the time that they received the COVID vaccine series, they likely won't need an additional dose to have that sufficient immune response. But again, I think it needs to be individualized to the particular patient and sort of the course of everything that they've gone through with HIV and with their COVID vaccine doses. But I think in general, if they had an undetectable load, a normal immune system at the time when they received their initial COVID vaccines and nothing has changed during that time, I think likely they don't need an additional dose at this time. But again, all of the specific patient factors should be discussed with a healthcare provider and an individualized decision sort of arrived at together.
Absolutely. We have a question related to antibody levels. So this is coming from our audience here. The question is with reference to antibody after Pfizer and correlating to age. For people over 60, there seems to be hardly any change, meaning antibody is low soon after vaccination, and it's again low in a few months. Why is that? Maybe Dr. Nguyen, you can take that question.
So the discussion is about the low antibodies over the age of 60 and then low after a few months. And it's seen between all the different vaccinations, older populations just produce less antibodies. But one of the key discussions that Dr. Hurley-Kim talked about is that what's the threshold? There is no threshold. Antibodies are only a part of our immune system, including T cells and B cells, the cells that get rid of other infected cells. So they play together in an orchestra to actually help us provide the immune response. So one of the rationales of looking at the antibodies is that we know that we lose them over time, and we really want to figure out how much we're losing and at what threshold. But currently, as I previously mentioned, vaccine effectiveness is still great. It's like 86%, right, to prevent hospitalization. Thank you.
And then we have a few questions that are related to crossing over vaccines, and I guess any of the speakers can take that one. Crossing over vaccine as a booster, is that possible? Or can you cross over if you had J&J for the first round, let's say back in March, can you get a booster vaccine of another, let's say one of the mRNA vaccines?
I think unfortunately this is another question with the answer we don't quite know yet. There are studies, especially in Europe, looking at primary vaccination with one vaccine, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine that we don't have approved here in the US, and then followed up by a booster dose with an mRNA vaccine, for example. I think it's reasonable to suspect that this might be an effective strategy, but we don't have, there are a lot of different trials that will need to be done comparing, which one was your first series versus which one is going to be the follow-up. And unfortunately, we don't have, even when we're talking about Pfizer and Moderna, for example, if you had first series with Pfizer and follow-up booster dose with Moderna, is that an effective combination? It's reasonable to suspect that it is, but we'll need more information before that's actually recommended. So for now, it seems like the preliminary recommendations are all along the lines of your booster dose ideally would be the same vaccine as was given for the initial series. And unfortunately, I think it's really almost heartbreaking, the lack of data that we have for people who receive Johnson & Johnson as the first dose, because every single one of these things that comes out is related to the mRNA vaccines. And then there's a little asterisk that, we don't have data for or a recommendation for the J&J patients at this point. So hopefully more information to come in the next few months.
And I suspect that's going to be the case. We will be getting a lot more information in the next couple of weeks or even couple of months, and very likely we'll have another webinar to address some of these concerns. So stay tuned for many of you who are on our mailing list. I have a question here that came in, and this is interesting, and I think any of our speakers here can take this question. Since there are many unknowns based on what you guys have all talked about, what sources would you recommend for individuals hoping to stay abreast of changing recommendations? Dr. Nguyen?
I think you should come back to our next webinar. But seriously, I think a lot of it will come through like the health department, the CDC. And so these announcements, once they occur, they'll be more like earth-shattering in terms of it'll be announced everywhere, and we want to make sure that everyone knows about it. And it's not something that they're just going to mention and then walk away from. So I think the main avenues of Department of Public Health and CDC is probably the best bet.
Dr. Griffin and Dr. Hurley-Kim?
I think probably my favorite resource for vaccine information and resources, especially for members of the community, in addition to providers, is immunize.org. And this is an immunization coalition. They produce a lot of really excellent informational materials and things like that for the public as well as for providers in order to have discussions with patients. So they are a really great resource. Also, the CDC in general, there is a lot to sift through on the CDC website. I do realize that. I think immunize.org is one that's a little bit easier to swallow for most people.
Dr. Griffin?
I definitely agree. I think certainly when it comes to sort of real-time discussions of adverse reactions, the information provided by the CDC and some of the discussions based on the different committees within the CDC are definitely solid, reliable sources of real-time information. And I definitely rely on the information published by the CDC when I'm looking at particular recommendations.
Thank you. And yeah, I think it is important that we are looking for credible resources to find the latest information related to vaccines, because once again, there is a lot of misinformation around, and we need to make sure that we go to credible resources. So some of the resources that our speakers have just mentioned about, those are certainly important, will be useful in order to stay abreast of the current literature. I also got a few questions from the audience related to what UCI is planning to do when it comes to rollout of the booster vaccines. And I can tell you that we don't have much information at this point. And certainly because we're waiting for a lot more of the concrete recommendations in order to know how to act on some of these recommendations. But stay tuned for those. And I'm pretty sure that, you as a UCI employee will hear a lot more about how the booster vaccine is going to roll out within UCI. So I want to thank, again, all the speakers, as well as all the participants for today's webinar. Very glad that, we have this great opportunity to be in touch with our community, to educate everyone, about the latest science related to the vaccines, boosters. And like I said, the information is currently changing. We have a lot of updated information coming up in the next couple of weeks or months. So stay on top with us come to our website, or you may be getting emails from us if we are running another webinar in the next weeks or months or so to provide additional update. But to learn more about our school, the UCI School of Pharmacy, Pharmaceutical Sciences, you can go to this website, pharmsci.uci.edu. So once again, thank you everyone for staying with us, and thank you for all our speakers. Have a great day, everyone.